History is the science that nothing lasts forever. And the best confirmation of this is the fate of the colossal empires of the past, which seemed indestructible, but were still destroyed and remained only on the pages of textbooks. The most vivid example is the Roman Empire, the state, the power of which, according to many historians, taking into account the correction for the level of technology, no one has yet reached. The huge empire, whose plumbing and judicial system we still use today, disintegrated and then collapsed. And there are still debates about how it happened. And at the same time, myths and conspiracy theories are born. In fact, as regular viewers of our channel know, everything is much simpler, more realistic and down to earth. We will talk about this in the next few minutes and explain how and why the Roman Empire fell. Well, let's start with a little warm-up with some facts. And the first one is that no one knows exactly when Rome fell. According to the most common version, the date of the fall of the Roman Empire is considered to be the 476. This is the day when the last emperor was overthrown and the barbarian Odoacer ascended the throne for the first time in history. But there are many nuances here. First of all, we're talking about the Western Roman Empire, because first of all, in 395, the country was divided into eastern and western parts, and the eastern part, known as Byzantium, lived on for thousands of years. So if you say that Rome fell in the year 1453, when the Turks took Constantinople, you'd be right. How right will you be if you say that? In the year 476, the emperor simply changed, and the empire collapsed in the year 630. For up to that time, the legendary Roman Senate functioned even under barbarians. To this day, various historians and philosophers offer their dates and interpretations. The reality is that we cannot point a finger and say that Rome was here and it is no longer here. Such a mighty empire could not disappear in one day. Therefore, in order to understand the problem, we will first go somewhere in the 180th year of our era, a time when the empire was at the height of its power. The territory had reached its maximum size, and internal politics had finally settled down. Emperors stopped bickering with the Senate and treated power as a toy. The period from the 96th to the 180s is called the Era of the Five Good Emperors and is considered by historians to be one of the best times to live on the planet. The rulers of the Antonini dynasty were characterized by incredible wisdom. Well, this list should be expanded to include the beautiful Vespasian, who ruled a little earlier. But that is not so important. What is important is that when we look at the map, we see a unified and incredibly powerful Rome. The emperors of this era came to an agreement with the Senate and finally stopped the constant power struggles that, in the past, could result in for emperors changing the throne in 1 year. And the financial merits of Vespasian, who almost did not wage wars, helped to replenish the treasury. And Trajan and his friends took full advantage of this, conquering Assyria, Arabia, settling internal conflicts, and winning the love of the people. This is perhaps the main story, for the five emperors had an interesting approach. Rome had moved away from aristocratic traditions for a few centuries, and leadership positions were given to worthy people regardless of their background. For example, all of these emperors chose worthy successors approved by the Senate and the army, so that the position of emperor was inherited by a professional. This in itself was good for the state. But the last of the five, Marcus Aurelius, broke with tradition and left the succession to the native son of Commodus, who went down in history as the man who, in a few measly years, destroyed almost everything that had been achieved in a century, and was killed in the year 192. After that, Rome plunged into another power struggle. It went down in history as the crisis of the 3rd century, when army emperors appeared on one throne, then emperors of the Senate. The empire lost territory, but the power of the ancestors was still felt, and two important moments were unfolding in parallel. The first was Christianity. The canonical Roman Empire, as you probably know, is Jupiter and other pagan gods. Friends, do not miss the release of the next video. Don't forget to subscribe and click on the bell, and we continue. Christianity was persecuted, and the emperors, including the not-so-bad Diocletian, encouraged attacks on Christians in every way possible. However, they became more numerous, and while the destruction of temples was a trifle in the 1st century, by the 3rd century it was causing serious rebellions, and after the Emperor Constantine in 333 years recognized Christianity as a religion and forbade persecution, began the reverse process, already hunted down pagans, which, of course, society for the good did not go, as did not go and fragmentation of the empire. For it is foolish to think of Rome as unified, even in times of her power. Throughout its history, Rome did not impose its way of life on anyone. People were not forced to speak Latin, they adopted traditions and assimilated naturally. It helped gain territory, but for most of the empire's history, it was divided. After all, its eastern part spoke Greek, which the emperors not only did not forbid, but encouraged, respecting the culture. Therefore, in the year 395, the division into the Eastern and Western Roman empires would occur, but it should not be seen as critical. Yes, de facto there were different rulers, laws, and customs, but they were in almost every province and before. For ordinary people, not much changed. After all, the state had been fragmented before. Diocletian, in the year 293, approved quadruple rule, which made for large areas at once, and his successors then united or divided the country, depending on the circumstances and the difficulties of managing a huge mechanism, to transfer the emperor's decree from Rome to Byzantium over thousands of kilometers. In those times was almost unreal, and considering the fact that the throne was often occupied by mad rulers, these decrees were not distinguished by reason. The logic of separation is simple, because with it there will always be a person who maintains stability. The real problem and the reason for the collapse is that, in the 4th and 5th centuries, this very stability no longer smells. First, the army. In times of power, Romans willingly joined it, because in addition to patriotism, service was associated with excellence such as salary and land plots. But what about the children of these men? And especially with the children of the Romans, where all the taxes and coins flowed down the river, and even more with the next emperor, who really needs money. As a result, since the 3rd century began destructive processes. On the one hand, the army desperately needed volunteers, but on the other hand, there were not so many of them, and on the third hand, in the conditions of stopped campaigns to pay them was not much. Salaries were delayed and taxes on the population were constantly increased, which virtually wiped out the middle class from the face of Rome. Finally, the small craftsmen and landowners, having gone bankrupt, went to the big ones, and along with the middle class died the legendary common imperial market. This happened just as the crisis of the 3rd century was unfolding, and although there were glimmers of quality of life, basically trade was almost dead, and with it a large part of the taxes, which were compensated by new levies on the population. If it had only been a matter of maintaining the army, all would have been well. But at the time of Constantine, who adopted Christianity, there were as many as 2 million monks in Rome. They just went there because they were not required to work, and the money for their upkeep came out of the pockets of the people. For a second, the total population of the empire was about 55 million. This is another story, by the way. The colder climate, the extermination of the middle class, and the greed of the upper class created a terrible demographic crisis. In the 150th year, there were 65 million people living in the empire. In the 400th year, there were only 50. The wealthy part was steadily aging and celebrating, while the poor were dying out and struggling to survive. There was no fertility to speak of under such conditions. So there were fewer and fewer economically active people to feed the Arab monks, legionaries, and aristocrats, as well as those willing to join those very legionaries to earn pennies, which also delayed. And on the other hand, there were more and more barbarians on the borders. Defending against them with a demoralized and small army was unrealistic, and the history of Rome came to the fact that with the barbarians tried to be friends. Emperor Theodosius I allowed the Goths to settle in Rome. For some time the barbarians took an oath to protect the territories. For some time they were hired to protect the borders from the same barbarians. But all this led to the obvious event, the barbarization of Rome. In general, even after the division into eastern and western parts, the western part had a hard time. Its borders were full of Germanic and other barbarians, who by the beginning of the 5th century were living in the empire as if they were at home. Various rulers still tried to repel their attacks, and in the case of Telechonov, in the years 402 and 406 quite successfully. but the army was practically non-existent, and even then some of the legions consisted of barbarians conscripted into service. And in the 410th year of Vesta, the Goths, led by Alaric, took Rome. Strangely enough, it went down in history as almost the most humane conquest of the city in history, because the barbarians were Christians and did not commit any particular atrocities against the Pope's brothers. However, this did not prevent them from plundering the capital, and most of the monuments were not touched. But if there was any gold on them, they took it with them. In the first half of the B century, the empire was still trying to kick, but the Goths weren't the only barbarians. There were Huns, there were Angles, there were Saxons, and one Attila drank a lot of blood from both the Eastern and Western empires. And when Constantinople managed to pay off shamefully, Rome was subjected to several brutal attacks at once, and the icing on the cake was a repeat. This time a brutal sacking of the capital in 495 years. The barbarians even took the roof off the Capitoline Temple of Jupiter. Only the sudden death of Attila at least gave the empire some respite. And if Rome was sacked, imagine what happened to the rest of the country. The barbarians there were not at all ceremonious and created their own states. De facto to 460 years from the Western Rome remained only the territory of Italy, and the barbarians there elected their own rulers. The last emperor of Rome was Maurian. He tried to return something after conquering Spain and part of France, but was overthrown by another barbarian, Rotsimera, who took the post of emperor. This continued until the year 476, when the Germanic barbarian Adocar officially sent the Roman insignia of power to Byzantium and called Rome his kingdom. It is this date that is historically considered the fall of the state, but hopefully you have already realized that this story is greatly exaggerated. In fact, Rome died much earlier, and barbarian rulers were in it much longer and before Adocar. And the issue of Rome's fall is not about one bourgeois Germanic warlord. It has to do with ever-changing emperors, rising taxes, demographic crisis, and the aristocracy's complete detachment from reality. When the empire still had money and power, there were millions of idlers running around the state. To feed them, a lot of money had to be spent, and under such conditions, the existence of the legendary Roman legions became impossible, because they won through discipline, loyalty, and patriotism. Discipline with the personnel crisis, loyalty with the delay of salaries. Well, what patriotism are we talking about when the legions began to consist of barbarians and mercenaries? So there is no magic in the story of the fall of Rome. There are only facts that say that the Rome of today has almost nothing in common with the Rome that fell 15 centuries ago. Technically, Rome was Byzantium for a whole millennium, still trying to hold on to its power. Well, and the funny fact is that the Third Rome can be considered Moscow from some point of view. In fact, the niece of the last Byzantine Emperor Sophia has married Moscow Ivan III, and the line of Roman emperors has already continued in Russia. And as for the western part, the Germans, as you know, never once tried to poke at Rome, calling it their homeland. And there the revived Holy Roman Empire was abolished by Napoleon already, in the year 1886. But on the other hand, to think of it as Rome is the same as saying that modern London is a descendant of the Celts. The real Roman Empire didn't fall overnight, and for more than one reason. On what topic to make the next videos, write it in the comments. Not to miss the next videos, do not forget to subscribe, click on the bell, and put a like. See you later, friends.